What does it mean to be Charlie in France today? And what about the French citizens who declare that they are absolutely not Charlie? What's on their minds? And are they even free to express it? These were a few of the questions we set out to answer as we explored the tense landscape that has unfolded across France since the January 7th attacks.
Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. That was a clip from a new documentary film that's running on the Real News, Je ne suis pas Charlie. This is a documentary film about the killings at the Charlie Hebdo office where the staff were executed. It sparked an outrage of protest in Paris, where people came in their tens of thousands saying, "We are Charlie." Well, now joining us to talk about We Are Not Charlie and what the significance of that means in the studio is Max Blumenthal. Max is an award-winning journalist, best-selling author. His latest book is The 51-Day War, Resistance and Ruin in Gaza. Thanks for joining us, Max.
Good to be with you.
But this ain't about Gaza, which is usually, the Middle East is your wheelhouse. But you were in Paris. What sparked this film?
Well, it is about Gaza. And, you know, Gaza is, and the Israel-Palestine situation is not limited to a geographic space of land in an area that's about the size of New Jersey. I mean, this is an international crisis. And this is, in many ways, this film is about the reverberation of this crisis into the French landscape, along with the immigration crisis, the crisis of French citizenship, the crisis of French nationalism, the economic crisis in France. It's all wrapped up in this phrase, Je suis Charlie. What does it mean? And when I went to France for a speaking tour for Israel Apartheid Week, I became kind of part of the story because there was an attempt to shut down my talks in French suburbs at universities like University 8 and Saint-Denis in Paris, which are primarily attended by minority groups in France, including Muslims. Attempts from the top to paint me as an anti-Semite. There was threats from the Jewish Defense League, which is a right-wing Jewish extremist group, to intimidate the universities.
So these posters were ripped down by security, dispatched by the administration for 3 days. The event was postponed under the premise that I'm a controversial speaker and that thugs from the far-right Jewish Defense League would come to campus and create a security problem. So it was first postponed, then it was canceled, and now under massive pressure from the public, it's back on. But this was a clear attack on free speech, one of countless attacks on free speech that we've seen since the Charlie Hebdo massacre, and it's mainly targeting the left and the Muslim community.
The same thing happened at the University of Bordeaux, and I began filming first my own experience with my friend and colleague James Kleinfeld, who's a British videographer who was studying in France at the time, in Paris. And we started interviewing people on the street about what it meant to be Charlie, or we started interviewing French Muslims, particularly young French Muslims who are politically assertive about why they would declare that they're not Charlie, and what it's like living in an atmosphere in which Islamophobia and anti-Semitism have really bubbled to the surface, while the French middle class, the Catholic and Protestant middle class, seems completely oblivious to the experience of French minorities.
On est tous Charlie.
Ouais, et qu'est-ce que ça veut vous dire être Charlie?
C'est-à-dire qu'on est pour la liberté d'expression, qu'on
n'est pas indifférent à ce qui s'est passé.
Exactement, qu'on soit juif, n'importe quelle religion, on est tous libres dans le sens... parce que Charlie, ils étaient peut-être pas pour une certaine idée par rapport à une certaine religion, mais c'est la liberté d'expression et c'est toute la France qui est comme ça.
Oui, je suis Charlie dans le sens où c'est les valeurs les plus profondes de notre société qui ont été attaquées. Ouais, c'est le fait, la France pour moi, voilà, le pays de la liberté et notamment le pays de la liberté d'expression. Et c'est pas, la devise, c'est pas juste des mots, liberté, égalité, fraternité.
Bien, la femme musulmane voilée, en fait, c'est absolument la même chose que quelqu'un qui est typé au niveau de la couleur, qui est noir par exemple, parce qu'elle porte finalement un stigmate racial comme vêtement. Et donc qui provoque des discriminations au quotidien, des insultes au quotidien, pour certaines des violences physiques.
Justement, on on est, j'ai envie de dire, doublement discriminés, mais triplement discriminés. Pour les femmes, vous êtes arabe musulmane. Le troisième, c'est si vous portez le foulard. Vous voyez, ça va crescendo.
The reason I say it's not your normal wheelhouse, because to a large extent, this film's about French national psychology.
Yeah.
Than it is about Islamophobia, almost in a way. I mean, certainly it's about Islamophobia, but you dig into why so many Parisians and French people had such a reaction. And I have a friend who lives in Paris, and she is, I would say, progressive. She's not super political, and if she's watching this, she's going to know who I'm talking about. But certainly on the Middle East question, her sympathies are with Palestinians. She fully understands, I think, you know, the role of Israel and the occupation and the repression and so on. She understands Islamophobia too. But she went out there and marched, and she described. I challenged her on it when I saw her not long ago. Why? And she said, first of all, it's the first time we Parisians, who were always just sort of on our own, actually came out in solidarity. And two, it was this violent attack, we thought, on our rights. That what some of the essence of French is that we have a right to be creative and to be outspoken and so on and so on. What do you make of that? Because in your film, I don't hear that voice so much, a little bit perhaps, but people who are kind of progressive, you could say, but who were out there marching.
Well, we interviewed dozens and dozens of French Muslims, and I know many just through my own experience in France. I couldn't find one who would defend these barbaric attacks, and there was no support for them. There was a different perspective on the attacks and an understanding of the killers, the Koulibaly brothers, for example, as a product of the French system and as something that is organically French, and not as a exterior problem that emanates from Al-Qaeda. I mean, their identification with Al-Qaeda comes from their alienation and marginalization within French life, and that's something that your friend might not recognize. But what we saw, and what I tried to show at the beginning of the film when we interview people in Parc Monceau, in a really affluent arrondissement or neighborhood of France, with interviews with upper middle class and upper class Parisians, is the obliviousness of the minority experience and the Muslim experience. When we ask about French values, the two preeminent values for this element are laïcité, or secularism, even though they're not genuinely secular, because many of them are Catholic, they just say we wear our cross on the inside, and two, free speech.
J'ai pas senti moi, spécialement une libération de la parole raciste. En tout cas, j'ai vu, oui, j'ai entendu parler de cette personne qui s'est fait arrêter parce qu'il avait défendu l'attentat des frères Kouachi. Et non, moi je trouve que c'est une très bonne chose. Après, on peut dire ce qu'on veut sur que le post Facebook soit du domaine de la vie privée ou de la vie publique. Mais oui, le fait de pouvoir faire l'apologie de ce genre de choses, ça me paraît normal que ce soit réprimandé. C'est des valeurs de notre République.
La croyance, c'est en soi. On n'a pas besoin de l'afficher, ni avec des voiles extrêmes, ni avec comment dit-on, la burqa, etc. Donc nous, on a une petite croix, mais on la met à l'intérieur, on n'est pas obligé d'afficher.
Je pense même que d'une certaine façon, ça a un peu libéré la parole aussi, ces attentats. Les gens s'expriment davantage, ils expriment plus franchement leur point de vue, et les débats sont peut-être un peu plus clairs aujourd'hui qu'ils ne l'étaient avant.
And this is a group who has never experienced speech being wielded against them in a hateful, derogatory way to demonize them collectively as a group. They've never been incited against by French leadership. French Jews might understand this historically, but this group doesn't understand the peril that it puts you in to be incited against 24/7 on media, to be harassed every time you get on the Parisian metro. And so there's an obliviousness about liberal values and how they can be turned against a population. And what we do with this film, Je ne suis pas Charlie, is show how the liberal values of laïcité, the supposedly liberal values of laïcité and free speech, have been wielded in a totalitarian fashion to demonize and marginalize French Muslims. And they've been adopted by Marine Le Pen and the National Front to become one of the three major parties in France. I mean, Le Pen isn't calling for, you know, fascist expulsions of French Muslims. She's calling simply for upholding in an extremely authoritarian, stringent fashion these values to which it's impossible for them to adhere because it means that they have to leave their religion and their own identity in the cloakroom by not wearing hijab, by not wearing the dress that they want to wear. No such demand is being made of French Jews who want to wear kippot, you know, kippas in public, and it shouldn't be, by the way. But this is clear discrimination against French Muslims using liberal values.
Il faut se mettre en situation de répondre à la guerre qui a été déclarée par le fondamentalisme islamiste.
Yeah, actually, in part of my challenge with my friend, it really hit me how I could start to understand the growth of fascism in the 1930s, both in France and in Germany. The extent to which people with liberal values could so easily succumb to the pressure to actually join a protest with someone like Netanyahu marching in the front of it.
Right.
And that's okay. The fact that they can manipulate people with these liberal progressive values so easily in that moment.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it's not astounding because we've seen what the Israeli policy is like, but when you see Jews, French Jews, who suffered exactly this, talking this way. And we're going to show a clip from the film. Some I guess they're Orthodox Jews.
Some are Orthodox, but you know, you're in the suburb of Sarcelles here, and this is a mostly impoverished suburb of Paris. 1/3 of the population is Jewish, 1/3 is Muslim, 1/3 are other minority groups, and so you have Jews, mostly of North African descent, who are generally pretty religious, mixed among a Muslim population, who feel like they're under siege.
Okay, so here's the clip.
In Sarcelles, an impoverished Parisian suburb with a substantial population of Muslims and Jews of North African origin, we encountered the same sense of fear and resentment, but expressed without any reservation.
Écoute-moi ils sont en train de renverser le monde aujourd'hui. Et le monde ne fait rien, le monde reste immobile. Là, l'Iran et l'Irak, ils auraient dû être rasés de la carte là, depuis longtemps. Mais le monde entier ne fait rien, ils attendent.
L'antisémitisme qu'on est en train de voir, je ne sais pas si la France va pouvoir refaire surface. Parce que là, d'un côté, l'islam qui représente plus de 6 millions. Nous sommes qu'une poignée par rapport à eux. Donc il va falloir que nos jeunes aient au moins une formation paramilitaire pour faire ce qu'on avait fait le 20 juillet. C'est-à-dire qu'on s'était mis derrière les CRS pour bloquer les gens qui arrivaient.
Est-ce que vous connaissez les gens de la Ligue de défense juive?
Ils étaient là.
Ils étaient là.
Ils étaient là. Eux aussi se sont mis sous le commandement des CRS. Et on avait déclaré zone militaire fermée. Pourquoi? Parce que, et ça s'est pas passé dans les médias malheureusement, parce que ça les intéressait pas. L'ULDJ, eh ben, on a quelques-uns, j'en connais quelques-uns.
D'accord.
Mais ils sont pas aussi violents qu'on essaie de les diaboliser, comme on essaie de diaboliser Le Pen aujourd'hui, en veille d'élection, alors qu'en réalité c'est l'islam de France qui fait pas son travail. Si vous voulez, ce ne sont pas des groupes paramilitaires, mais lorsqu'on est attaqué à un certain moment, il faut se défendre. Si ces groupes de défense rentrent sous les instructions du ministère de l'Intérieur ou du ministère des Armées, premièrement, ils seront encadrés, deuxièmement, ils seront plus responsables. Lorsqu'on fait descendre l'armée pour protéger des Français contre d'autres Français, c'est un début de guerre civile. On est en train d'y aller.
So contextualize that for us.
Well, what you saw in that clip was you saw a man calling for basically eradicating the population of Iran and Iraq, who appears to have been of North African descent, so an Arab himself. So this community leader, David Haik, led us to a monument for French Jews who were killed by an Islamic extremist in Toulouse at a school, and began telling us about his support for a fascist group, the Jewish Defense League, his desire to incorporate this fascist group into the French police, the fact that they're already arming up for a kind of what he calls a civil war with French Muslims. So basically a clash of civilizations within Paris between two groups which have been traditionally discriminated against, while the kind of French middle class just stands aside and watches. And finally he defends Marine Le Pen, who is a neo-fascist leader whose father was a Holocaust denier. And so here we see the growing support of some French Jews for the National Front and Le Pen because of her stated Islamophobia, her Islamophobic goals. And this is, I think, one of the most disturbing scenes in this film, because it shows how Jews and Muslims have been pitted against each other when they should be natural allies. And, you know, I don't believe in the United States, from my experience, the experience of Jews, I know that anti-Semitism is a factor in American life. If anything, you know, we're experiencing a kind of philo-Semitism here. In France, it is sort of, it is a factor in life. I mean, you've seen these massive attacks against French Jewish targets. Muslims experience racism on a much lower daily level. It's more mundane and kind of a slow-growing campaign of hatred. For Jews, it's occasional attacks. But the French elite, the kind of people who speak of the language of laïcité or secularism, I don't believe they're great fans of French Jews either. And we could see after these attacks how their agenda dovetailed with that of Netanyahu's when Netanyahu showed up at the Great Synagogue in Paris and called for French Jews to leave. He called on all French Jews to leave and move to Israel, which is their true home.
כל יהודי וכל יהודייה שירצו לעלות לישראל יתקבלו על ידינו בזרועות פתוחות ובלב חם וחפץ.
This is something, I don't know how many French Jews accept this, but this is something that works well with an anti-Semitic, a traditional, classical anti-Semitic agenda in Europe, in which they don't really want French Jews to be there.
And we know there was some of that same kind of collaboration during World War II.
And it's been ongoing. I mean, there was the Havara Agreement, the transfer agreement between Nazi Germany and the Zionist movement to exchange Jewish bodies for a portion of their wealth, which helped insulate Germany from the effects of the Great Depression. But when I was at the kosher supermarket, before it had been reopened, you know, it was still littered with these tokens of solidarity for French Jews. And within the dead flowers, the piles of dead flowers and flags, we found pamphlets that had been placed by some kind of organization representing French Jewry, which was promoting, on behalf of the Israeli government, mass immigration to Israel.
2 months after the January 7th attacks, the Hyper Caché supermarket is almost ready to reopen. Outside, we found sidewalks littered with symbols of solidarity with France's Jewish community. Among the piles of dead flowers and spent candles, we found pamphlets promoting a mass Jewish exodus to Israel.
So this is Lev Ha'ir, and it's the weekly magazine of the French Jewish community, or at least some wing of it. And it's promoting Aliyah to Israel, or mass Jewish immigration to Israel. And so they're promoting these very cheap settlement units for French Jews who are terrified of living in France any further.
I mean, from the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs in Israel, along with ads for settlement units, cheap settlement units for French Jews to move to. So the promotion is happening at such a massive level in the wake of these attacks.
Now, free speech was one of the big banners of that mass protest, but this whole film started you trying to speak and them trying to close you down.
Yeah, I mean, some speech is freer than others.
So we'll show a bit of the clip from the film where Max's speaking engagement is closed down. Eventually, you get to speak, but they try to close them down.
We learned that some speech is freer than others in post-Charlie France. No, but you should give yourselves a round of applause, because it was because of your pressure and your outrage and your action that we are actually in this room right now and not out in the cold, and that is an achievement for this movement, so you should feel free to give yourselves a round of applause. Or you can wait for the translation of what I just said.
So what happened?
Well, the administration of University 8 in Paris claimed that I was a controversial speaker, which is exactly the kind of person that students should hear from unless that person is preaching racism or bigotry, although I don't think there's a criteria for that, considering that half the French government is doing that. And that Jewish Defense League thugs would come on campus and attack the talk, and so there's a security issue, which is a tactic the JDL uses to create the specter of fear, even if they're not planning on doing anything, and they weren't anywhere near my talk. So it was initially canceled. We promoted we publicized the cancellation, and so there was a lot of public pressure on the university. And so they allowed me in. The talk went on. Everything was fine. Same thing happened at the University of Bordeaux when I went down there to speak. Over a number of Jewish groups condemned the talk, one of which was sponsored by the government and the other was the JDL. And one of the sponsors of my talk, which is an anti-racist group, had their offices vandalized after the talk, and video that CCTV video showed that neo-Nazis had actually attacked their office, which is highly unusual, but there's a disturbing atmosphere in Bordeaux. That night, I went out into Bordeaux with my hosts, one of whom was a hijabi woman. She wears a veil, and these are the people who are the most targeted in French society because it's obvious that they're Muslim, whereas someone else, a Arab Muslim male, it's harder to know that he's religious. And we were with some of her friends who are Algerian and Moroccan, and we were walking down a street in the old city of Bordeaux, and she comments to me, "I'm glad you're with me because usually I get insulted on this street." And I said, "Well, you know, it's nice to be your white savior." And right then, a man throws a lit cigarette directly onto her. And I moved to confront him, and he's sitting at a bar, and one of our friends pulls me back and says, "Don't go there, it's a fascist bar, you'll be attacked." And that's the atmosphere that they're living in. And from then on, we went on a tour of bars in this area, which they'd explained to me were essentially whites-only bars. People of immigrant background would not be allowed in these bars without being harassed or attacked. So the atmosphere in southern France was much more extreme than even in Paris. And that's the base of support for Marine Le Pen.
This was the home base of the Vichy regime during the Nazi period, wasn't it?
And going back before that, I mean, you look at the splendor of Bordeaux. That's the result of, that's the legacy of colonialism, the exploitation of Africa. I mean, the backdrop of colonialism is so omnipresent in France, and France maintains its engagement in the Middle East and Africa in a project that's neo-colonial. So that colors the crisis or the miniature clash of civilizations we're seeing.
Well, the film ends with a rather chilling prophecy of a clash to come, or in process, but more to come. Here's a clip.
Et ce qui est terrifiant, c'est que ces attentats, ça sert tout le monde, sauf les musulmans. Et ceux qui sont morts.
En réalité, l'État-nation a visé les musulmans, les lois sur le voile, mais en vérité, à partir du moment où on dit le voile n'a plus le droit de rentrer dans l'école, les juifs sont atteints d'une manière ou d'une autre. Et moi, je crois qu'une partie des juifs se rendent compte qu'il y a une nécessité absolue à lutter contre l'islamophobie, parce que de toute façon, ça va retomber sur les juifs.
So the right using Islamophobia, not the right, the fascist right, using Islamophobia, your film is predicting and saying it's taking, has real traction, I guess one would say.
Yeah, I mean, with the socialists and with the party of Nicolas Sarkozy, you almost don't need the National Front anymore. What they're trying to do is, in a way, what we would call triangulation. They've co-opted the language of the National Front because it's been so successful to detract and deflect from their own economic failures. And we've heard Manuel Valls, who is the French Prime Minister, one of the leading candidates to be president, first of all, use the term Islamofascism, which we've only heard used in kind of extreme Islamophobic circles in the United States by figures like Pamela Geller and David Horowitz, and he's using it as a national leader and a the face of the French socialists. I mean, this is a guy who, as mayor, had celebrated Palestine. He had Palestine Day when he was mayor, and so he's shifted to adjust to the new mood.
Mais il y a surtout ce nouvel antisémitisme qui est né dans nos quartiers sur fond d'Internet, de paraboles, de misère, sur fond des détestations de l'État d'Israël et qui prône la haine du juif et de tous les juifs. Il faut le dire, il faut poser les mots pour combattre cet antisémitisme inacceptable.
He has explicitly conflated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism and pledged to fight what he calls the new anti-Semitism. So he's reinforcing what is already an official crackdown on Palestine solidarity activism in France, where over 40 BDS campaigners for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement have been called to trial simply for their speech. And Sarkozy is doing the same. You have people in his party proclaiming that colonialism was not so bad, and maybe we need to teach the good side of colonizing Algeria and Tunisia. And then at the local level, the National Front has won some seats in local elections, and we're seeing local officials from the National Front call for the registration of Arab citizens of France, having basically their names picked out of local census rolls and forcing them to register. Where did we see that before? So the disturbing trends and the echoes of 1920s and 1930s Europe are beginning to reverberate in a way that is more disturbing than ever. And these attacks, like the attack on Charlie Hebdo and the kosher supermarket, accelerate this process, and they're designed to do exactly that. These attacks are designed by their orchestrators, the ideological figures within Al-Qaeda and especially within ISIS, to increase polarization and to convince Muslims living in Europe that there is no alternative but jihad. There is no democratic alternative to this kind of system. So you have two sides colluding with one another. You have a transatlantic right-wing project that's pushing Islamophobia and Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations to bring it about. And you have the same thing within the Middle East among these ghoulish figures in ISIS and Al-Qaeda who want the same exact process to convince Muslims around the world that there is no possibility of living or being a citizen within a democracy, and that the only alternative is jihad. And the results are what we're seeing on the streets in France and what you see in this documentary, Je ne suis pas Charlie.
All right, thanks for joining us, Max.
Thanks for having me.
And as I said, you can watch the documentary on the Real News Network. Just look up at the very top of the website. You'll see a link to the film. And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.